anatomy lab. I'm meeting with some students at different times before this, but at 4:30, anybody who comes along, if we can get to the anatomy lab, I'll be there. And if the lab's busy for some reason, I know that there's chairs out there in the hallway, those little mini lobbies, those little alcoves. So I'll be around Sunday, late afternoon at 4:30, and I'll stick around as long as people have questions. But I suspect that I'll probably be leaving sometime really soon. And then, and I still don't know yet, I'll be able to be over here late afternoon, early evening, either Monday evening or Tuesday evening, but I won't be able to be around on Wednesday. Okay. But I'll be around at least one of those on Monday or Tuesday to answer any questions. Okay.
Would it be possible to do it on Tuesday since we would be getting the questions on Monday?
It's kind of out of my hands.
Oh, okay.
It's out of my hands, and it's something that I probably won't get to know myself until Friday afternoon. So,
fine.
Yeah, I would prefer myself. I prefer to do it on Tuesday. And I'll be sending out some example cardiovascular questions for you to work through. I'm hoping to get those sent to you a little bit after midnight on Sunday night, Monday morning. That's what I'm hoping to do. So, okay. Any questions, anything you want to talk about before we roll along here? So we've talked about intrinsic properties of the heart. We've talked about arteries, arterioles. Now going down the vascular tree, the next thing is getting to capillaries. In some ways, they're not the only business in, all the elements of the vascular tree or the business end of the vascular system. But now let's look at what's going on with capillaries. So the capillaries, that's the site, that's where you have the transfer of those gases. Oxygen diffusing out of capillaries and into tissues, CO2 diffusing from the tissues into the capillaries, the delivery of nutrients, cell secretions, metabolic end products, but CO2 would be an example of that. So the simple structure, and if you happen to have a histology course in the undergraduate program, you had this to a heavy-duty degree, but just simply, when you look at capillaries across the body, they are a single layer of endothelial cells. So they they constitute the endothelium. So it's a single layer of cells, but some capillaries are also surrounded by something else, which isn't really considered part of the capillary. Some have a basement membrane around them, and then up in the brain, you not only have the endothelial layer, you have basement membrane, and then you have other cells wrapped around those. So those are support structures, are not considered the capillaries themselves. You take a look at how these endothelial cells, how they fit together, and your book doesn't magnify this much, but there's these, what are called intercellular clefts. Inter means across, intra means within, so these are from one cell to another. There's these intercellular clefts, and depending on which cell you're in, sometimes these clefts are really, really loose and leaky. And for example, up in the brain, they're pretty tight. But these clefts they're gaps. They have fluid-filled or water-filled channels in them. So this is what makes capillaries leaky, those intercellular clefts. And some capillary beds are more leaky than others. And your book kind of does the yin and the yang. The brain has the tightest intercellular clefts, and that really limits the transport that can occur there. And your liver is on the complete underside, very loose clefts. A lot of transport can occur in those clefts between the capillary and the tissue that it serves. So those clefts are important, but different organ beds have different tightness in those. Now, some capillaries in their walls also have endocytotic and exocytotic vesicles, and what that means is, just like you saw releasing packets of neurotransmitter, you can have vesicles budding out, releasing materials into the tissues, and sometimes it's vesicles coming in through the capillaries, releasing molecules into the lumen of the capillaries. Different capillary beds have that. That's pretty well developed in the brain. The brain is very picky in what crosses that blood-brain barrier, and so that's more developed in the brain. So a little bit more about this structure is, here's the arteriole, and these stripes represent smooth muscle. So remember, most arterioles have smooth muscle, and how much blood is flowing through that arteriole is so much regulated by how much smooth muscle contraction you have. And remember, smooth muscle contraction gives you vasoconstriction. If you constrict the radius of that arteriole a little, resistance to blood flow goes up a lot, and therefore, you know, when you have a huge increase in resistance, you have a huge decrease in blood flow. Remember that equation. So, depending on the degree of vasodilation or vasoconstriction, you really can affect how much blood is going to be perfusing. Perfusing is simply the blood flowing to a tissue bed or organ. So perfusion is blood flowing to that tissue bed or organ. So if you have strong vasoconstriction, the amount of perfusion is going to go down a lot. If you vasodilate, you'll perfuse this organ with even more blood. But you can affect the resistance to blood flow and how much blood is going to go through that arteriole quite dramatically in some beds by the degree of vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Now there's another element in here, these precapillary sphincters, that they also have some smooth muscle. So not only can you, so blood's going to come through this arteriole and then go across the capillaries, and then they will coalesce into the venules, and then that blood will flow into the veins. So you really regulate how much blood is going into this tissue bed by how much blood is going through that arteriole due to the tone of the smooth muscle. Plus, in many capillary beds, you also have these precapillary sphincters that, what regulates them? Local metabolites. Remember we talked about how when we're in arterioles, whether that arteriole is going to vasoconstrict or if it's going to vasodilate, it's under the control of a number of things. External mediators such as sympathetic nervous system will cause vasoconstriction. Certain hormones will cause vasoconstriction in that arteriole. But the more metabolically active this tissue is, the more local metabolites are released, CO2, adenosine, potassium, or even low oxygen. What does that do? That causes this arteriole to, the more active that tissue is, the more you're going to produce those metabolites, and the more vasodilation you're going to get, and the more blood flow you're going to get. That's even more so with those precapillary sphincters. They're very sensitive to metabolic demand. The more metabolically active that the tissue is, the more those metabolites are being produced, and the more relaxation you'll see. So it is a balance, it is a balance. There is tone in the smooth muscle and in the arterial and these precapillary sphincters. So you're kind of at a basal level and you can relax a little bit, that increases blood flow, or you can constrict a little bit and that'll decrease blood flow. And your book does make a point that for several precapillary sphincters in the body, that if there's very little metabolism going on down here, there's going to be very few local metabolites, and these sphincters will just completely close. They'll completely close, and that pretty much decreases blood flow to almost nothing to that metabolically inactive tissue. So there's quite a bit of range for regulation. And once again, local metabolic factors, I think I've talked to maybe 3 or 4 people about this now. For example, when you're exercising, your sympathetic nervous system is turned on, and sympathetics flowing out to large numbers of arterioles. What does that do? That norepinephrine binds an alpha-1 adrenergic receptor, and it'll cause vasoconstriction. That's what the sympathetic nervous system is trying to do. Vasoconstrict vascular beds throughout the body to reserve blood flow to exercising muscles. Once you get to the muscle, you're producing so much local mediators that even if sympathetic outflow is bombarding the smooth muscle of that arterial, local mediators almost always win. These are the boots on the ground. Those metabolites are telling this smooth muscle, okay, we have high demand here. We know better than the sympathetic nervous system that's originating up in the brainstem. We're here. We're on the ground floor. We know what's going on. So the more metabolites, the more opening you have of the arterial, of these sphincters, and the more blood flow. Even if that area is being bombarded by sympathetic stimulation, local metabolites predominate. And that's the beauty of the system. Sympathetics will try to decrease blood flow to a lot of places, and then only those places that have a lot of metabolism, they open wide up, and that gives more blood flow to those areas. Yes?
Do capillaries behave more like arterioles than venules?
Pardon me?
Do capillaries behave more like arterioles than venules?
Well, it depends on which venules, because there are some venules that are quite different from other venules.
Because we were just wondering, so like when a vein vasoconstricts, it actually allows more blood flow, right?
It actually does what?
Allows more blood flow? Because it like stiffens?
It will increase venous return, but that is, see, that's where it gets dicey when you're talking about venules versus the great veins.
Okay,
And
so
it's actually a little bit different.
Okay.
It's actually a little bit different. Because I see what you're saying, and we'll talk about that. When the great veins stiffen, they lose their compliance, they pressurize the blood,
Yeah.
and because of one-way valves,
Yeah,
it drives the blood toward the heart.
So that isn't necessarily what happens in...
Exactly. So I do want you to be comfortable with the idea that local metabolic demand very much regulates blood flow in those capillary beds. Now, there is, many capillary beds have these met arterioles that can represent a bypass. Sometimes you don't have, you just have blood going from an arteriole through a met arteriole straight to a vein. And there are some places where you do that in certain conditions. So the met arteriole, if this tissue doesn't need blood flow, it'll just take left heart blood and put it into blood that's going to the right heart. So it's really a left to right shunt bypassing this capillary network. But even with metarterials, you have precapillary sphincters. So when appropriate, if blood's flowing through these guys, if these precapillary sphincters relax, you're going to get blood flow there. If those precapillary sphincters tighten, you're going to have decreased blood flow there. Not all tissues have these metarterials. Okay, so when you're going through the vascular tree, you know, the book mentions, and I never realized, we have 25,000 miles worth of capillaries. Kind of impressive. So all those capillaries, they're very small. They're on average, they're only 8 microns in diameter. And remember, red blood cell is 7 to 10 microns in diameter. Luckily, red blood cells they're not rigid. They can contort themselves to go through a small space. But if you look at the cross-sectional area of the vascular tree, the vast majority of the cross-sectional area is in the capillaries. So more cross-sectional area, more surface area available for diffusion. And your book has a nice illustration. It's actually the A part of this figure. I probably should have left it on here. That when you go to the capillaries, and there's so many capillaries, and collectively that's so much cross-sectional area, it's the same amount of blood going across the capillaries in total as what's coming out of the aorta. It's just that there's so many more tubes, so many more blood vessels carrying that blood. There's much more cross-sectional area in the capillaries than any place else. And one thing that happens is more cross-sectional area, the slower the velocity of blood flow. Okay, so more tubes, and your book has, the A part has a nice illustration of that. If you just have blood going through one tube, it's moving kind of fast, but you separate it into 10 tubes, everything slows down a lot, yeah.
So in order for the pressure to keep going and not to lose pressure to the rest of the body, you can't have all capillaries active, like allowing blood flow through the body, right? Like not all capillaries are going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Not all capillary beds will be perfused equally. Some will be pretty much turned off. Some are going to be wide open. And you know, most of that, it's not really shown on here, but most of that pressure drop is across the arterioles. And you don't have everything opened up at the same time, because your total peripheral resistance would be incredibly low, so your blood pressure would go incredibly low.
And also for the difference between arteries and veins, like the difference in pressure, like there has to be a pretty substantial increase of vein total cross section, right? Like
Cross section? What?
Like of total cross section area of the veins compared to the arteries, right? Like
Are you talking, because you just switched there? It went from pressure gradient to cross-sectional area.
yes.
That pressure slide that I gave you last time, you look at that slide and you look at this slide together,
Mhm.
because you'll see that what you're talking about, there's a pretty strong drop in pressure as you go across that capillary bed into the venules.
Mhm.
And you need to have that to maintain the gradient so you have flow.
Okay.
So those two, what you're talking about, look at those two slides next to one another and go, okay, what is this contributing to that one? Okay, so the velocity of blood flow across individual capillaries is very, very slow, and that's a good thing, because that really makes it ideal for diffusion. And do remember that we already talked about diffusion. It's surface area times diffusivity, which is, it's I wrote that wrong. That's lipid solubility divided by molecular weight of a substance. The whole thing is diffusivity times the concentration gradient divided by the thickness of the barrier of the membrane. Hopefully you remember that better than I did. But that's low velocity, that increases diffusion potential. Plus the other thing, and this is by far more important, is the surface area. All that increased cross-sectional area makes more surface area available for diffusion. So there's a huge amount of potential diffusion area in the capillaries. So, and your book has, boy, your book just comes right out and says it. And I'll put this quote in here because I just like how, in all capillaries, excluding the brain, diffusion is the only important means by which movement of nutrients, oxygen, and metabolic end products occur across the capillary wall. That's made possible by having so many capillaries, so much surface area, and it takes a while to go across those capillaries. For example, going across the pulmonary capillary from the arterial side of the pulmonary capillary to the venous side at resting cardiac output, it takes 3/4 of a second. That's a lot of time to allow for exchange, okay, for a certain volume. Now, they do mention, and this gets to that vesicular transport, when you're talking about supplying the brain, it's not just simple diffusion. There's also a lot of mediated transport because the body's very picky on what gets across the blood-brain barrier. So I just kind of throw that in because it is important. So now we're going to talk a little bit about capillary fluid dynamics. And this is something that a lot of people kind of get flinchy and twitchy about when they come in from an undergraduate program, because sometimes the equations are set up kind of difficult conceptually to understand. I'm going to show you a very easy way to remember it. At least most people say it's easier for them to remember it this way. But there's fluid that's constantly being exchanged through those intercellular clefts between the plasma and the tissue. So, that's going from the plasma inside the capillary to the interstitial fluid, the interstitium. So, tissue fluid, interstitial fluid, that's all what you find in the interstitium, the area between the cells outside of the vasculature. So think back again about the extracellular fluid compartment consists of plasma and the tissue that surrounds cells that are out here in the tissue, and that's interstitial fluid. The whole area is called the interstitium, right? So we're constantly exchanging fluid from capillaries to the tissue and from tissue to the capillaries. And at different times, sometimes you'll be exchanging more in one direction and then more in the other direction at a different time. So this is how you maintain your extracellular fluid balance. So we have this exchange going on all the time. So their filtration is the movement of fluid from a capillary into the tissue or into the interstitium. That's filtration. And reabsorption is just the opposite. It's when fluid moves from the tissue fluid or the interstitium into capillaries. And we have this exchange going on all the time. Okay? Now, so when fluid is moving from the capillary out, that's filtration. When fluid is moving from the outside of the capillary in, that's reabsorption. Okay? And I put those 2 arrows for filtration, 2 arrows for reabsorption. There are 2 potential forces that favor filtration. There are 2 potential forces that favor reabsorption. And so that's what we're going to look at, because there's different pathologies that will cause a difference in those elements, and therefore it changes the balance of this filtration and reabsorption. Sometimes your body wants some of that tissue fluid to come into the vasculature to help support blood pressure. Other times, for both good and bad, fluid from the vasculature that can go and accumulate in the tissues. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's not a very good thing. So let's first look at filtration. So there's two forces that favor filtration. So filtration, once again, is movement from the capillary into the interstitium. There's a pushing force, and there's a pulling force. But in both cases, they're going from the capillary to the interstitium. So what's the pushing force? The pushing force is this CHP, that's capillary hydrostatic pressure. What is that? That's just blood pressure. That's just the blood pressure, the pressure of the blood inside a capillary. So capillary hydrostatic pressure is just capillary blood pressure. And does it kind of make sense to you that if the blood pressure is higher in here, it's just going to push more fluid out through those intercellular clefts? Yeah, just kind of be okay with that if you can. If you can. Now, out here in the tissue, in the interstitium, there are proteins. There's proteins out here, and guess what? Proteins pull water toward them. They create an osmotic force. They create an osmotic force. So there is tissue or interstitial osmotic force out here. The more proteins, the more force you'll have. And what do? They pull fluid out of the capillaries into the tissue. Once again, that's in the direction of filtration. So filtration is going from the capillary into the interstitium. And there's a pushing force and a pulling force. Are you kind of okay with that? I hope. So let's now look at reabsorption. There are two potential forces for reabsorption. There's a pushing force and there's a pulling force. So one potential force is the tissue hydrostatic pressure. That is just the pressure of the fluid that's there between cells in your tissues. So that's interstitial. You can call that a lot of things. Interstitial fluid pressure, interstitial hydrostatic pressure. Yeah.
Did you say that interstitium is the space between like the muscle tissue and the capillary?
It's everything outside that capillary. So I don't care what tissue you're in. You might have hepatocytes, you might have muscle cells. So it's everything outside of the capillary, but outside of cells. So remember, the extracellular fluid is this fluid inside here and this fluid out here. So, different tissues, some tissues have almost no tissue hydrostatic pressure, some have more. So, but there would be this potential force for pushing fluid into here, but there's also a pulling force. That's capillary osmotic force. And once again, this is due to proteins. The more proteins that you have in the plasma, the more pulling force that you have. So I'm not going to talk about lymphatics too much, but in a lot of tissues, there's just a little bit more filtration than reabsorption. And any additional fluid that accumulates out here, it's collected by the lymphatics and it drains out that area. So over time, you have a little bit more comes out than what is coming in across that tissue bed. You have this optional drainage system, the lymphatics, that will drain out that area. Yes?
So when your body needs more from your capillaries, they dilate, right?
Well, capillaries don't really now.
The sphincters just relax, and then there's more blood flow. Does that increase pressure and increase filtration, or?
If you, it really depends on what's happening in other tissues, but if other areas of the body, let's say here we have capillaries for one tissue, and here's capillaries for another tissue, if those are vasoconstricted, it's going to increase the pressure of the blood that's going to be going through here. So that's going to increase the capillary hydrostatic pressure in a local bed. Yeah, in a local bed. So it's very much regulated. But if you have strong vasoconstriction up here, guess what? Pressure here actually goes down because you're going to have less flow, less pressure. And when we get to the kidney and things like that, it becomes very easy to see that, because you'll see this equation, it happens, or these forces happen all throughout the body. Those you had, remember your physiology when you looked at glomerular filtration in the kidney, it's the same thing. And sometimes some of these numbers go up and other ones go down. So I'm trying to think what's in the, okay, so net fluid movement across capillaries is determined by the balance of those forces. And the way I set up the equation, and you just need to understand this relationally, I put filtration forces on this side, so capillary hydrostatic pressure plus tissue osmotic forces, their filtration forces, minus the reabsorption forces. And that you're going to be able to tell if you have net filtration or net reabsorption. And there's a whole bunch of pathologies that change this balance. So some examples. And in the text, I kind of elaborate on this more, and your book does talk about it too. So let's say if blood pressure drops significantly. So if you have a huge decrease in a hemorrhage, you have a hemorrhage, so your mean arterial blood pressure goes down a lot. Your capillary hydrostatic pressure will go down. So you're going to have less filtration. Now, these proteins and this tissue hydrostatic pressure, they don't change. They're not going to change very rapidly anyway. But if the pressure of the blood coming in here is now much lower, what's going to happen is filtration forces will be less than reabsorption forces. One of the very first things that happen for compensation due to a hemorrhage is tissue fluid starts going into the vasculature, and it can be as much as 1 liter of fluid in the first hour. Your blood pressure drops, and your book has a nice, later on in this chapter, nice explanation of this. Blood pressure drops, filtration goes down, reabsorption staying the same, so the balance changes and tissue fluid is going to start coming in. And what does that do? That's helping to support your plasma volume, that's helping to support venous return, that's helping to support blood pressure. Yes?
So, does that mean that, for example, if we have capillary bed in, I don't know, the stomach, and it's open because we just ate and it's giving blood to it, once that's done or something else comes up and it closes off the arterioles because there's blood needed somewhere else,
Okay.
and there's almost no pressure going through because the arteries are closed, then you have all this fluid in the interstitial area. Does that mean that more fluid is gonna dump into the capillaries?
Yeah.
I mean, theoretically.
Yeah, there is a shift, but once again, think of it this way with that example of a significant hemorrhage. All over the body would be experiencing that drop in blood pressure,
Mm-hmm.
and if you look at what happens all across the body in the first hour, you have the transfer of 1 liter of fluid into the vasculature from the tissue into the bloodstream in 1 hour. So you're talking about, changes in minutes in a small area rather than the whole body. So yep, would there be milliliter differences?
Yeah,
in
I mean,
fluid?
yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's not huge.
Okay.
So your thinking is right. It's just that wouldn't be a large
Okay.
number. So your thinking is right.
Dr. Crouch?
Yep.
On that same note of the hemorrhage, so you're getting an increase in reabsorption when you have a hemorrhage.
Yeah.
And is that by an increase in the capillary osmotic force, or is it?
No,
decrease? The
it's
decrease in
because
capillary
you
causes
have,
it.
so you have filtration going on, you have reabsorption going on. If filtration goes down, the reabsorption forces will have more of an impact. Even if these stay exactly the same, because what we're looking here is net fluid movement. So actually, the reabsorption forces are exactly the same. The reabsorption rate may be exactly the same. It's just that there's less filtration going on. So, so the net is, they do talk about a net and reabsorption, but really what it is a lack of filtration will make the normal reabsorption start transferring more plasma to or more tissue fluid to the plasma.
So it's just a switch in the balance.
That's it. It's the balance. Normally it's like this, and if filtration goes down, that means, and if this stays the same, what are you doing? You're accumulating fluid from the tissue into the bloodstream. Now, your body never overcompensates. So if your mean arterial blood pressure was 90 and you have a significant hemorrhage and it's down to 65, compensation by all the mechanisms going on, it's not going to make you go above 90 or 93. It's just not going to be as low as what it was if you didn't have compensation. Your book has now, in this edition, has a really nice time course illustration of that. Another thing, what if you have an infection in a tissue? If you have an infection in a tissue, a number of things actually happen. You have increased permeability of the vasculature. The vessels get more holy, and materials can pass back and forth more readily. But if you have an infection, one thing that happens is plasma proteins start streaming out into that tissue. And what does that do? More protein out here, more osmotic drawing force. There's more pull that's going to be going on. And guess what? You might have swelling. Or let's say not even an infection. What if you sprain an ankle real bad? You sprain an ankle real bad, you have damaged tissue, you have macrophages coming in, and what are they doing? They're chewing up the protein elements of those damaged contractile filaments. So now you have all sorts of protein particles in your interstitium. What does that do? That causes increased tissue osmotic force. More fluid's going to go into that area, and it's going to swell. So it's a balance of that equation, yeah.
So I'm not sure how deep we can go into this, but what drives the force of when you have an infection or a sprained ankle? What drives the force of the plasma or like macrophages to want to get out at the specific moment?
Okay, so if you have an invading pathogen right here, you have constant surveillance by immune cells that are located in the tissues, and they release something called chemokines and cytokines. And chemokines are molecules that will direct other immune cells to the area, and they release these cytokines that will do all sorts of things. Vasodilate, cause increased permeability.
Okay.
So with inflammation, you get this redness, increased temperature, swelling, all these types of things, and it's because of this wonderful interplay between these surveillance molecules. Since there's an invader here, I'm going to release signaling chemokines, and other things are happening. You're going to get adhesion proteins being elaborated on the surface, and the bottom line is white blood cells that are normally flowing past will start rolling, and then when they get to the site of a lot of those chemokines, they do something called diapedesis. They will actually be drawn into the tissue area where they will meet the invader and try to ingest them and kill them. Yeah.
So when that's going on, are there also, or like, cytokines that are drawing more white blood cells and stuff from other areas of the blood? So is there like increased concentration of those in the blood anyway that they would just naturally diffuse across? Or is it only the local?
They're always in circulation, but depending on the intensity and duration of that event, you can cause an increased proliferation of those if it's an ongoing day event.
Mm-hmm.
But actually on the venous side, you have, for neutrophils, you have a large number of neutrophils that they're just stuck to the venules, loosely stuck to the venules. And if you happen to have some type of challenge going on in the body, they're mobilized, they're released. So they were always sitting there, but they're what's called marginated. They're just sitting there waiting to be called, to be pulled off the bench. And when you have invasion signals going on, they're what's called demarginated. They go into circulation and they go all throughout the body until they encounter adhesion molecules and chemokines that will then allow them to stick there and then be drawn across at that. So it's really kind of cool system that we have players sitting on the bench ready to get into the game. Plus, if that continues on long enough, then you'll make new players too with cellular proliferation.
So during the infection, since you have an increase of proteins to the tissue, which increases the fluid there, do you have a change in blood pressure?
If it's widespread infection, you do. Yeah. If it's something that is more systemic, then yes, that's a very complicated thing going on, because different types of infections, yes, they increase vascular permeability. Boy, you're going to learn a lot about this. But different systemic infections going to cause this widespread increase in vascular permeability. Fluids and proteins go out into the interstitium, and blood pressure just goes down, down, and down. And the other thing with certain infections, have you guys heard anything much about gram-negative sepsis yet? Okay. In addition to the vascular permeability problems, is with gram-negative sepsis, the endotoxin that's being released into the bloodstream actually decreases myocardial performance. So the heart does not beat as efficiently, so your cardiac output can start going down. So there's another reason why blood pressure goes down in those individuals. So bad situation. Okay, so this edema is inappropriate swelling, tissue swelling, and I just wanted to give you one example in your book, give some other examples, but all of you have probably heard about left heart failure. When something happens with that left ventricle, so it can't perform at the level it's supposed to. So here in simple pictures, and you guys may have already seen this at much more sophisticated detail, but I like to start very simple, and then you can add things onto it later. Now, there's several causes for pulmonary edema. That would be accumulation of fluid. So here's systemic circulation, here's pulmonary circulation, and you can have accumulation of fluid here, and that fluid can actually get into the alveoli. So here's an airway, and this represents many different alveoli in the area. So there's a lot of different reasons for pulmonary edema. One of the most common is left heart failure. With left heart failure, that left ventricle is not ejecting all the blood that the right heart is delivering to it every minute. So what happens if more blood's coming in than it can eject, well, blood just starts building up in the pulmonary vasculature. Now, the pulmonary vasculature is very low resistance and it's quite distensible, but it does have a limit. You can build up blood. What do you think if blood starts backing up in here? What do you think is going to start happening to the pressure in pulmonary capillaries? It's going to go up. That's right. And normally it's very low. It's like 5 or 6 millimeters of mercury pressure. But if blood backs up, and have you guys dealt much with Swan-Ganz catheters and things like that? Well, there's a way of measuring pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, and if pulmonary pressure goes up to 18 to 20, you will start having increased filtration and fluid accumulation. So if blood backs up into the pulmonary vasculature, that causes an increase in capillary hydrostatic pressure. In this case, it would be pulmonary capillary hydrostatic pressure, and that leads to pulmonary edema. So it looks something like this. In a normal healthy person, over time, left cardiac output must equal right cardiac output. That's the way we're put together. That's from beat to beat. There might be a little bit of variation, but 2 beats later, your body handles it in a normal healthy person. So what happens, and I've already talked about this, what happens if that left heart pumps out just 1 drop of blood, and 1 drop of blood is considered 1/10 of a milliliter, 1 drop of blood less with each beat than what the right heart delivers to it? What happens over a minute time? Let's say somebody has a heart rate of 80. I think in your notes I put 70. But in 1 minute, 8 milliliters of blood is going to back up. That doesn't sound like much. 8 milliliters is a little bit. Over 1 hour, man, that's close to 1/2 of a liter. So just a small deficiency over a fairly short period of time, an hour, man, can you imagine if all of a sudden you have an extra 500 milliliters of blood backed up in here? Well, what happens is as that blood is backing up, what's changing here? The capillary hydrostatic pressure. In this case, it'd be pulmonary capillary hydrostatic pressure. Yeah.
So with this, other than, like, what would be the solution to this? Other than, like, if they have to go surgically, but do they give any medication to slow down?
Diuretics. And then trying to, well, you know, it depends on why do you have the left heart failure. You have diuretics, and the other thing is you want to decrease afterload. Afterload is the pressure that the heart is having to pump against after it starts that contraction phase. So you will be trying to manage afterload.
Okay.
And so you have to get fluid off of the person, and you're going to manage the afterload to try to relieve this. Now, sometimes, you know, you're going to find there's all sorts of different reasons why maybe that left ventricle for just a short period of time is in a crisis. Other times it's a chronic condition, and it's just going to have to be managed ongoing. So it just depends on what caused that left ventricular deficiency leading to failure. But it's just this is where you can see just simply that by that blood backing up, you're going to get pulmonary edema. So there's a lot of different ways of, so we're going to get fluid building up here. And what is that actually doing? Think of the Starling forces equation for diffusion. The thickness of the barrier for diffusion is actually increased. So diffusion of gases will go down. That person's going to have more problem getting oxygen in and getting rid of CO2. So you're actually changing the diffusion capacity of the lung. So left heart failure is when right cardiac output is greater than left. It will lead to edema, and dyspnea is faulty labored breathing, and somebody who has pulmonary edema, you think you can get them to lie flat? No, they feel like they're gagging and drowning. They want to lean up, sit up for good reason. So there's many different things that can lead to this. Long-standing hypertension can cause basically wear and tear on the left ventricle. You can have a weakened left ventricle due to some type of viral or bacterial myopathy, maybe a myocardial infarction, coronary artery disease. What if you have stenosis? What if that aortic valve is becoming calcified. It takes more and more pressure to drive blood across that thickening valve. And at some point, the ventricle begins to fail because it's been working so hard to do it. And even what if you have the opposite? What if you have regurgitation due to valvular insufficiency? It flaps back. So every time this heart ejects blood, some of the blood comes sloshing back into it. So vastly different reasons that can lead to these things, but all of them one way or another can lead to pulmonary edema. And just to kind of go the other direction, you can have a situation where you can get what's called dependent edema, where if something's going on in the right heart, and there's a lot of other reasons for dependent edema, a lot of other reasons for it, but if you happen to have a right heart problem and the left heart is actually supplying more blood to the right heart than it can pump out, just the opposite occurs. The edema is happening out here in the body. It's called dependent. It's dependent on gravity. If somebody is standing up, their ankles swell. If they're lying down, the swelling's top of their hips and their lower back, like that. It depends on the gravity. Unfortunately, a lot of people have a sick heart and get all sorts of bad things happening. So let's try to get a little bit through veins here. So veins, do remember, whoops, I didn't mean to have that there, but do remember arteries store pressure, and that's good because those arteries snapping down during the diastolic period of the heart keeps the blood pressurized and flowing down the arterial tree. But veins store volume. Something like 60% of the blood in your vascular tree is stored typically in the veins. They have the ability to just bag out and accept a lot of blood. So really the veins function as a volume reservoir. A volume reservoir that if you basically want to get more venous return, what you basically do is you just try to squeeze those blood vessels, and that gets more of that stored volume of blood into action, increasing venous return. Now, typically, venous pressure, I didn't give you that slide again, venous pressures are very low. Right here, it might just be 10 to 15 millimeters mercury pressure, but that's fine because here in the right atrium, it's around 0 during atrial diastole. So that's plenty of pressure gradient to get the blood back because there's so little resistance here. Very little resistance on the venous side, very little resistance. And also along here, the other thing that's helping, you have one-way valves. One-way valves. So venous system has very, very high compliance. Remember, compliance is change in volume for given change in pressure. So if you just pressurize this blood a little bit, those great veins just bag out and they just accept that volume. So there's great compliance typically. So one way to get more blood going back to the heart is to reduce the compliance, stiffen up those blood vessels, and that will cause the blood to return to the heart. So how do you regulate venous return? I've already given you a diagram on that, but venous return is absolutely vital for regulating end diastolic volume, stroke volume, and cardiac output. So venous return plays such an important role in supplying that blood back to the heart to support cardiac output. So unfortunately, some of these aren't working that right, but the sympathetic nervous system, there are alpha-1 adrenergic receptors on many veins and venules, and what do? They don't really cause so much venoconstriction. When you think of constriction, you think about a blood vessel getting really small. Venoconstriction is really the vessels, instead of bagging out, they just stiffen up. You know, that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier. And because of the one-way valves, that's going to drive blood back. So they have those alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. That causes that increase in cytosolic calcium. There is a little bit of smooth muscle in here, so that can stiffen them up a little bit. And because of one-way valves, that will send blood up to the heart, increasing ventricular filling, increasing stroke volume by Frank-Starling mechanism. So sympathetic nervous system activity will definitely support that. In the text, I've written that out quite a bit more. The skeletal muscle contraction pump. This figure is 1248 in your book. So throughout the body, and most, but not all, veins, you have those one-way valves. So when you have a muscle contraction, you have what's called an extravascular compression. So something outside of the blood vessel, that contracting muscle is going to squeeze that blood vessel. And what does it do? That vein is going to pressurize the blood. And venous blood is a fluid. It's going to flow from area high pressure to low pressure. So if this is being squeezed, it can't go this direction in a normal, healthy person because you have a competent valve. And you'll see a lot of older people that their valves are giving out, they get varicose veins and so forth. But in a young, healthy person like you, that one-way valve, that blood's going to be pressurized, and that's going to drive it in the direction where that valve can open. So because of this extravascular compression, it's going to drive blood toward the heart. Now, there's another way that we have another pump that helps get this going. Is it's your respiratory pump. If you take a deep breath, what happens to your diaphragm? When you take a deep breath, does your diaphragm go up or does it go down?
Down.
It goes down. So you take a deep inspiratory effort, your diaphragm goes down. What does that do? That drives down the abdominal viscera. So guess what? The pressure in your abdominal cavity goes up. When you make a deep inspiratory effort, what happens to the pressure, your intrapleural pressure in your thoracic cavity? It goes down. It goes down. It becomes even more negative. So when you take a deep inspiratory effort in your abdominal cavity, you have this extravascular compression, and up here on top, you're actually opening the blood vessels even more. So you have a pressure gradient. So deep inspiratory effort will actually increase venous return. And finally, blood volume. I think we've kind of talked about a little bit. If you have a hemorrhage, you're going to have less blood to return to the heart. So if you have a hemorrhage and a decreased blood volume, that will decrease venous return. And we talk more about that later when we talk about regulation of blood pressure. So do take a look at this book now over the editions, just more and more very good flow diagrams. So this is looking at increasing stroke volume by changing venous return. So yep, you can have an increase in sympathetic nerve activity. That will help increase venous return. Skeletal muscle contraction pump, that will increase pressure in the veins, driving the blood back to the heart. Inspiratory movements, that'll do it. If you happen to increase blood volume, that will cause it. Each of those will increase venous pressure. That increases venous return. That's going to cause more blood to come into that heart. That's going to increase ventricular filling. That will increase the end diastolic volume of the ventricle. That's Starling's law of the heart. So we have Starling forces, Frank-Starling mechanism, and you're going to get a stronger stroke volume. Okay? So all these things kind of go along with one another. So, boy, I was hoping we were going to get to some of those next things, but well, we did.